This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. I'm Winifred Lewis, and I'm a professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hey guys, I'm Austin Manchadi. I'm an undergraduate psychology student at the University of Queensland and a research assistant on this project.
That's right. And what we're doing is we're making introductory videos for each of the chapters in the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. The chapter that we're talking about today is chapter 37. It's called Neoliberalism and Social Environmental Movements in the Aftermath of the 2008 Financial Crash, Linking Struggles Against Social, Spatial, and Environmental Inequality. The author is Elia Apostolopoulou, and they're a human geographer and political ecologist, a senior researcher at the University of Cambridge and editor of Dialogues in Human Geography. So I think most people would be starting this video wondering, as I myself wondered, what exactly neoliberalism is. And it's quite a simple concept in a way. It's a political philosophy that includes an approach to nature where value is created when nature is turned into commodities. So the idea is that human well-being is at its peak when free markets distribute resources and commodify our natural world in such a way as to create economic growth. And it's a philosophy that goes back, beyond the financial crisis, right, Austin?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. You go back to like owning land and things. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first part of the chapter is really about where neoliberalism came from. And the way that it's framed, the emphasis is on the growth of neoliberalism after the 1980s. So before then, some of the traditions that we take for granted, like public land and public services, were generally seen as at the service of the community and controlled by the state. And so the neoliberal agenda seeks to change that approach and really divert the kind of power into the market and through the actions of corporations. So there's a kind of list of the approaches that the neoliberal governments, such as those of Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s, have progressed. And it includes privatizing public resources. So for example, you might take what was a public park and develop it into buildings, and marketization, where you might, for example, instead of regulating carbon emissions, set up a market or a carbon tax so that there's a price on carbon and people can trade. Deregulating, which is when you strip away environmental protections, usually so that the market will, in theory, do a better job. And associated with that, market-friendly re-regulation, which is when you replace an existing rule that was really about protecting the natural environment with something that will facilitate development. And introducing market proxies into the public sector. So this is when governments that might deliver services subcontract or contract to corporations that do the same. And then there's finally construction of flanking mechanisms in civil society, which is really when you create institutions and advocacy to promote these ideas. I feel like I've just kind of read off a long list, but what did you get from this part of the chapter, Austin? Or it's hard to come to grips with as a psychologist, I guess.
Well, I think it's a very interesting topic. And when they talk about, making it privatized and looking at ways to make it, I guess, to change the way it is, there's been a lot of debate since the great financial crisis asking whether or not neoliberalism is still relevant to the world.
Yeah.
And I think, some governments, national governments, have promoted it since 2008, but it's ignored the consequences as an effect of that. So sort of seeing how it's changed throughout time, it's a very interesting thing, particularly where it could take us in the future of environmental movements.
Well, that's right. And so the second part of the chapter is really critically evaluating the reaction to the great financial crisis in some parts of the world. And we're both based here in Australia, and I learned a lot about the reaction to the great financial crisis in Europe in particular where these austerity regimes are kind of imposed. And so the idea of this is that the great financial crisis in 2008 suggested some sort of mismanagement of public money by the government. And so as a response to that, budgets had to be slashed and services had to accordingly be trimmed as well. And there was also economic devastation because of the crash, particularly in Europe, not so much here in Australia, thanks to our different and wiser policies. And so as a result of that, there was a real emphasis on development. And so this second part of the chapter critically evaluates these austerity regimes in terms of how destructive they've been for the natural environment. So a lot of the development has been short term and arguably mostly for the benefit of private individuals and corporations. And it's taken land that was in the public sphere and made it available only to a subset of people. In Europe, for example, unlike I haven't really seen this in Australia, many beaches are privatized. So you can't even go to the beach. It's private land, and people have to pay to go. So this idea that what we in Australia have often treated as a public space that anyone can enjoy, and that's a part of everyone's life and everyone's summer. In Europe, you have to pay a corporation to enjoy natural beauty. It's a strange model. And so I think the third part of the chapter is really about how people have responded against that with new social movements, including environmental movements, particularly looking at environmental movements trying to speak out against development of public lands and turning, nature and water and air and forests into commodities. Do you want to comment on what you got out of that part of the chapter, Austin?
I think it's a really valuable thing to really try and preserve those. I mean, this is sort of off track, but the example I always think of is there was this movie years ago. People may know it's called Yogi Bear, right? It's a kids movie, but they had this huge, beautiful park with all these amazing 200-300-year oak trees, and this corporation from the government tries to come in and chop down the trees and turn it into logging rights and whatever.
Yeah.
And I think it's the park rangers and the characters and obviously the bear have to stand up and be like, look, no, we need this as natural wildlife here. We need it for the environment, produces oxygen.
Mm.
I'd say it's a very relevant thing for everyone to an
Yeah.
extent, because if you strip the green out of a city, it becomes very cold and lifeless. And I think that from a psychology perspective can definitely impact mental health as well.
Oh, no doubt about it. That's right. And so many concrete material benefits like you just talked about, or we've been talking about, that you can't go to the park because it's been, all the
Yeah.
trees have been chopped down. It's an extraordinary blind spot, I think, philosophically and politically, to consider that a forest's value lies in logs. Of course, logs are one part of the value of a forest, but there's so much more, and particularly for our well-being and our functioning as a species as well. We do live in a natural world. So yeah, reading it from the outside perspective in a country perhaps where neoliberalism hasn't gained quite as much traction, the whole philosophy is difficult and problematic. The pushback that's described in the chapter is really about the way that movements have tried to create new occupations and resistance camps, new cooperatives, grassroots initiatives, new forms of alternative energy and low energy, low impact conservation and living, and ideas of like community gardening and self-managed farms that take away from the idea that all kind of food and consumption should be done in this context of the market. So creating these alternative ways of getting food and products to each other. And then there's a sort of idea of creating new commons of the land, soil, water, seeds, air, food, biodiversity, and cultural and social practices. So the idea here is just recreating public spaces that are not about money, whether that's in the form of public gardens that everyone can enjoy or in the form of jointly managed farms like urban farms. I think we've seen a little bit of those urban gardens recently here in Brisbane. That is, people are creating gardens in the West End, for example. Yeah, where you can kind of go along and plant and also go along and harvest. It's a community enterprise. What did you get out of this part of the chapter, Austin?
As I'm somewhat biased, but I'd say it's definitely it's a good idea, particularly,
Yeah,
maintaining, having those public spaces, because they bring a lot of value. Again, I go back to the
yeah,
psychology because that's my sort of my thing, but
yeah,
it brings a lot of value on a, I guess, socioeconomic as well as a psychological and personal level. Obviously, you can't use the areas for private businesses and individual gain, but I think the gain as a community is much more valuable in the long term, as well
yeah.
as environmentally speaking.
Yeah, when I think of like the livability of cities, I'm a Canadian, as some of you can hear from my accent, but I've been living in Australia for 20 years. And I guess one of the reasons why you want to live in a place is because it's beautiful and there's places
Mm,
to enjoy in the outdoors. And so carving that all off and giving it away to individual corporations just seems so counterproductive. I guess that links in as well with the last chapter, which is called The Right to Nature and the Right to the City. And so the idea here is that this economic development and spatial segregation of communities and destruction of the environment are intertwined, but also that a sustainable society will have an intertwined understanding as well. Like we can't separate out our economic future and our environmental future. And so
mm,
the positive future that the author's putting forward is one where people will recognize, as in the using the language of rights, that we live in an ecosystem and we have to protect it. And we many of us live in cities, and we should be able to enjoy our cities, to move around them, to have public spaces, to gather
yeah,
together, to have leisure and recreation and protest and art and action in public, and not just have places where you pay tickets to enter. And
yeah,
again, I resonate to this message, and coming from a society which I think has perhaps avoided some of the worst excesses that are described in the chapter. I think it is important. I guess for me, one of the key messages that I hadn't thought about as much before I've read this chapter, and as you say, Austin, maybe because we're psychologists, but the extent to which the economy and the way that the economy is organized is really inseparable from the future of the environment.
yeah. It's a difficult thing, and I think people seem to look at it in a black and white perspective, where it's economy and or almost like left and left and right wing, where it's
Mm,
economy, finances, make as much money as possible compared to protect the environment. I think in reality, at the end of the day, you need to have a bit of being the gray in the middle, where you can intertwine both of them together,
mhm.
and you can have, like, I think Brisbane does a very good job of it. You have the city, but then 2-3 minutes walk to the west, I suppose, you have the gardens at QUT.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
there's
And
trees and stuff there.
I do think that that stuff can be under threat. I know in our city, as in other cities, development is a constant pressure. And maybe one of the things that's happened here, I was reflecting, is that our regular flooding is kind of helpful in that regard, because um, although we have destructive floods regularly, and that claim lives and destroy homes, one aspect of that is that all along our river are these lands that are unsuitable for development and that are beautiful green spaces. And maybe that's been a feature that can be discussed as well, how the local geography as well as the political context can empower certain approaches to the economy and the environment.
Definitely, yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to say just before we close this video?
I think you summed it up quite nicely.
Thank you. I pay him to say that. So I'll say thank you, Austin, for participating in the recording, and thank you to our viewers. We appreciated having you along today. Bye now.
Bye.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.